Okay, real talk, you don't have an error boundary and neither do I. When things go wrong in React, there's either going to be a blank page or we're going to swallow the exception. In this demo, we'll look at a few ways how a React error boundary can help us with dealing with these failures. Very well then, let's begin. When we look at the React documentation, what is an error boundary? Well, it's a class component that has a component did catch error lifecycle hook. And in essence, that's the thing that will react when inside of your render, there's an exception that's being thrown. Although it's not catching everything, so we'll need to take a couple of things into account. The docs are pretty clear, like if an error happens in an event handler, server-side rendering, or an asynchronous code, both these things don't exactly happen during your render, then that's not gonna be caught by an error boundary. There's no real hook API for an error boundary, so you're stuck with this old class style component thing. And in essence, if you're ever going to use them in practice, you're going to have this npm package, which is something where a lot of helper components are. We can do like this import error boundary components, then give it a fallback should it show something when it goes wrong. Or there's some other things where you can have more control about what should the fallback do. We can have like a method where we have access to some props, etc., etc. These all hook into the React side of things. We're going to have a little of an application here where we're having a counter when everything goes right, but when we have uncaptured here, it happened in an event handler and everything was just swallowed. So when we look at the code, package JSON, stuff you expect, there's React, there's ReScript React, there's the React error boundary. I wrote a bindings file for my error components. So when we take a look at React error boundary, there's an error boundary component. As you can see, I have some props over here. I have a make function that's going to be the component itself for importing. If all of this is foreign to you, I have a video on how that all works. But in essence, this is the binding where we can use the React application. So right now we have a couple of buttons. The success button, just update the counter. And in here, we're just going to do JS throw. So this is another more confusing thing. In ReScript, you have the concept of exceptions. Something is an error, which is a JavaScript error, but you can also have a custom ReScript exception. It confuses me every week. That's not what this video is about. And I really hope that at some point just updates and it gets better in ReScript. But for today, go with it. We're going to do different things which all kind of look the same. And I'll try to elaborate what we're doing. But again, it confuses me. And this video just might be for future Florian at the end. In essence, we have JS error throw, which is the throw new error over here. We clicked that and then eventually we just saw in our browser that it wasn't really showing anything else. What we can do is wire up a error boundary. So I have a main file over here. We have a React error boundary with a fallback component. So wait, shouldn't we have saw the error boundary? There's an error message over here. It's gonna get that the fallback props. Based on the props, it's gonna show a different kind of color text error, but you might already be confused. We added in our main function the error boundary. We clicked on the click handler, we do JS throw. Why didn't we see our error boundary? Well, that's already the first thing. We didn't see the error boundary because you need to capture the error. So in this case, instead of just having it throw in the click handler, we're gonna add it to some state. So there's the set state where it converts something to have the right type. And in essence, I am going to say, okay, we have an error, set error, use state. That's a hook. We have the error. If we have an error, then we're going to throw the error from our render function. Basically, different points in time. There's the moment where my click handler happens, JavaScript, event loop, all that kind of stuff. So it happens outside of the render. And that's why we need to capture the error, then throw it. And if we now go back to the browser, if I click on this thing, then it is caught by my error boundary. I don't really have any error details, but that's very understandable because we don't really, have details except the string from button. So why is the string from button empty? So we can see JSON stringify new error from button. Well, that's exactly what we see over here. So that's why this doesn't really have any details. First big takeaway is that not every error is going to be caught by your error boundary. It's only the ones that get returned inside of the render function itself. And then the big caveat is that event handlers and async function code doesn't apply to that. So you need to capture that specifically and return it from the render. And then your error boundary like this works. Another thing we can do, so I had a couple of buttons in in our application, and here we can also set an application error. Basically, this is a custom ReScript exception where I had a type definition of exception, and then this thing has a little bit of internal magic, as in it's gonna, convert that internally to this thing with a ReScript exception ID, and that can then be used to pattern match on specific errors. If we go to our error message component, what actually happens is we get from our props the actual error, and then we can do like a switch to see, is it our custom exception? And if that is the case, then we can show something else. So if you do control all the things where you want to use an exception kind of workflow, not sure if I would recommend it, but if you do need to do that or want to go that direction, then you absolutely can. Going back to the browser, the ReScript exception got caught, and these are our error details. And I was able to give, like a little more of a Flare error message handler thing, but you get the idea. We basically have like more control based on what happened. Another example you might have in some custom external JavaScript code where you are waiting for a promise and that promise is gonna reject, which is what we're trying to simulate in this tick tick boom thing. We're gonna have a timeout that's returning a new promise. If we have a click handler where we are gonna invoke the promise, over here we're having a button we call this tick tick boom, and we're gonna ignore the promise, but we are gonna have a catch handler. This is going to work as well. So over here, the external JS, we caught it. That's good. But the only reason this really worked is because we set our error. If we didn't have any catch over here, this is now going to be a promise that we're not really awaiting. So we're just ignoring the result. There's no actual hard await. So there's no throwing going to happen on the call side. And if we try and do this again, we can see that we have an uncaught promise. We have our exception, but it happened in another point in time in the event handler and in an async world. So totally not the render phase. And that's why my counter is still going up, but I actually have problems. So it is very important that you capture the actual error over here. Otherwise, your boundary is not going to kick in. Let's now take a look if we actually remove our error boundary handler thing. If we still return our error from our render function, you'll see that we're getting that blank page kind of scenario, like the exception got through. We're not doing anything on any render level and any parent component to deal with it. React has no idea, and we get the blank page. This is just game over. If we have a use effect where the first thing we do is just throw another exception, so compiled, that looks a little bit like over here, use effects, throw message, that's just going to throw, and this is going to be captured by our error boundary, but remember we don't have any, so on render this just totally crashes. The reason that this will work if we were to return our error boundary is that React will capture this inside of its hooks because it's synchronous. Because it happens inside the effect handler. Again, if this were to be some async code, then that would not be captured. And this is what we call like the typical footgun. So let me try and illustrate that one real quick. So this was synchronous, but synchronous inside of a use effect will be caught. We are going to like simulate some fetch data. We have an async function. We're gonna await the promise inside that. The promise will be rejected, but since this doesn't run in the render method, it's actually not gonna go anywhere. So if we load the page, we can see that, the uncaught, boom in the external world. The thing is that it just gets immediately swallowed inside of our use effect, our component mount. It all looks fine, but actually code didn't work. So how do we deal with that? Same mechanism really. We just need to capture that instead. Over here, we do promise catch, we do the set error, and this promise may have been gone into error. So how do we deal with that? We just get the promise catch, we get the exception, we set it as an error, and then we can see that our error boundary picked it up and immediately rendered the error because that happened on mount, really. Error boundaries guard us from the unknown shadows of the world. The trade-off is knowing when to acknowledge the unexpected. Until we meet again.